What's up, Flannelverse and Endgamers? We are back for week 3, Thursday night football. We have the Patriots at the Jets. Should be a slow kind of defensive battle here. So kind of fun for Showdown, not the most fun NFL game in general, but we'll make the most of it. Again, this is Showdown, so we can play whoever we want. Everybody's dealing with the same players, so we don't really care about the pace of the game. Sometimes these are the best Showdown games anyways. I am back with Adam, ShipMyMoney, Scherer, as we do every Monday and Thursday morning. We'll break down position by position, quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, talk about some defenses and kickers, and take any questions. We won't be building any lineups on this show, but we will have the conversation about all of these different players. While you're coming in, this I think looks like this is streaming to both the Flannelverse and also Endgame Syndicate's YouTube channel. If you have not already subscribed to both channels, highly recommend subscribing to both. And of course, we would just appreciate you subscribing to both. Adam and myself both trying to grow from small channels. So please do subscribe and, of course, like the videos if you have not already done so. That helps us out quite a bit. Comment, all of that stuff helps with the YouTube algorithm as we try to grow this channel. Adam and I both put a ton of work into all of our shows, so we would appreciate your support. Oh, and one more thing. I know that on Thursday there were several people watching the Thursday night stream who benefited from the video. I know several winners watched that video. So if you do feel like anything we say helps you out in winning a contest, we would appreciate any kind of shout out that you want to give us, because the best marketing remains screenshot marketing. So if any of you have big wins, I know we had somebody 6-figure win from the stream on Monday Night Football. So that was pretty exciting to see. And of course, no pressure. I know a lot of people are private. You don't want to share this stuff, but if you feel inclined, if you feel like we helped you win a contest, of course, we would love the shout out as we try to grow our channels. All right, Adam, that's enough intro. I'm ready to get into it. But first, how are you doing this Thursday morning?
Doing well. Just got baseball lineups in finally, so that's good. Shouldn't have to get too distracted during the show. But yeah, no, I'm doing well. I'm glad I wasn't on that Monday night show with you, because I did not buy into the Britton Covey stuff and would have argued against it. So glad I didn't screw anyone up with that. But I had a hard time believing that they were actually going to line up a guy that is my size as an outside receiver, but they did. So I didn't buy it, but you did, and people won with it.
It's pretty lucky that we got that news, because I was on the same page. It's like, well, they're not going to use Britton Covey as like a primary receiver. He's not going to be a starting receiver. Maybe he'll get a few snaps here or there. It was like I couldn't believe it either, given that they've had him, starting for the punt returns the past couple years, and he's never really played a lot on offense. I assumed he would stay there. Paris Campbell would slot in. He was called a Paris Campbell. Johnny Wilson would be fighting for those receiver roles. But then I thought just the fact that the news came so late, I figured the field wasn't going to adjust to it. It seemed pretty likely to me that, if they were going to be starting Paris Campbell or Johnny Wilson, like Paris Campbell coming from the practice squad, Johnny Wilson, not a lot of NFL experience, they would want them out on the field warming up. It was kind of my thought process of why I did buy into it. It was like, okay, if they were going to be starting one of these guys, they would probably be out there playing, with the starters in warmups. So I did lean into it. And thank you for not ruining that stream for me.
Yeah. Oh, I told you afterwards, like, I wish they just hadn't said specifically where he was warming up, because I agree with you too. And it's the same reason why I swapped my lineups for the Jalen Wright RB2 news, the previous primetime game. Like, the field's just not going to be there. So the risk reward is just skewed toward do what the beat writer says and hope that they're right. And that was certainly the case for Covey too. They specifically said he was warming up outside. And so my thought process was just like, okay, he happens to be the guy on the field right now, standing next to Devontae Smith and Jalen Hurts. Like, it didn't do anything for me where I was like, I think they're actually going to consistently do this. If they'd been like, he's in the slot with Devontae Smith outside, I would have been like, oh, okay, I'm getting a lot of Britton Covey. Yeah. So that was kind of my read, was like, okay, well, this is probably still a mess, because I just can't believe that's actually going to be a thing that they do, but it did.
And it's still like, other than like the largest field GPPs, if you didn't play him, it probably didn't hurt you that much. You put up 8.3 fantasy points. Right. Wasn't like the end of the world in smaller field stuff if you didn't get to Britton Covey. But yeah, the large field where you have to hit the nuts, he was the nuts. So yeah, Joe Blow says, someone in the chat reported, yeah, Baldy and the Oaf came through on Monday, came through and said, hey, looks like Britton Covey is lining up with the starters in warmup. So without that notification, again, I had been full fading. We talked about it in the morning show. That was a piece of feedback we got, was somebody responded on that video saying, I faded Britton Covey. I was like, all right, well, I mean, the evening show, we had a little bit more information. So, and Crutches says two catches were called back. So would have been more of an important factor if those had not been called back.
But yeah, I have to be ready for NBA season where I'll, say something at 5 p.m. or whatever, and somebody's gonna be mad at me because it didn't, like, I wasn't like playing by 7.
Aren't you so excited for that, just to get called out on your early takes before a lot of stuff changed? Yeah. I mean, that is the one benefit of the evening show. I like doing these shows with Adam, but then I have more information when I do the evening show. So there is some benefit to watching those. Somebody was actually asking me in Discord last week, like, well, what is the difference between these shows? And I was like, well, I talk with Adam in the early shows, so we have just a good conversation about the entire slate. I feel like you get a good overview, but we don't have all the information typically early in the day. I don't know if much is changing on this slate, for example, but like there are slates where it's like, yeah, you want to come back because there is going to be new information that we're going to, handle things a little bit differently with that information. Not always perfectly, as we saw with Cole Kmet. One of the previous slates got the news that Cole Kmet was, there were rumblings that he was going to get more run, and I didn't fully buy into it. And also he was kind of expensive, so I didn't care all that much. And it actually didn't bite me, but it really could have, because he was very involved. So don't always get it right, but at least we get that information. You can do with it what you want to do. Adam, I do need to correct something that I said on the last show. So we had, I thought, a good conversation about the extent that we care about coverage statistics, like how much should we care, how many plays per game does this actually come into effect. But the one thing that I do want to correct is, I said in that I had seen that there was like a 10% spread between the highest man cover rates in the league and the lowest man cover rates in the league. And that was just me misreading a chart. There was actually last year, it was a 30% difference. I think that I read the chart in the Fantasy Points data suite and just disregarded it when I saw the kind of thin spread. What I didn't realize is that wasn't the full 32 NFL teams. It was sorted by like player. So it was, it was the first page that I was looking at, and I saw just a 10% spread, but it was like 4 pages that in total, like showing the different coverage numbers. So it is a bigger spread than I thought between the top of the league and the bottom of the league in terms of the amount that they use man coverage. So that actually to me is more significant than I was giving it credit for. So it is something that as we get deeper into the season, I'll factor it in a little bit more. As of right now, I feel like there's been too many coaching changes. On this slate we have the Patriots changing, so I'm going to wait for Fantasy Points to update their coverage matrix to really start digging in a little bit more. Do you have any more thoughts on that conversation? Like, is it something that you look at pretty closely already? What do you think?
Your overall sentiment when you were talking about that was right, though. Like, it's still a very messy stat. It's not like defenses are just static and they're going to play 80% zone 1 week or every week. It's going to depend who they're playing against. They're going to adjust for opponents. They're going to adjust for the other team's personnel. So it is really messy in that regard. It's something I mentioned last week. Like, I'll look at it because right now I think that directionally you probably can get an edge in some situations, especially like for larger field tournaments. Just because I don't think so many people are using very similar projections that I don't think are necessarily accounting for it like at all. So if you can just kind of nudge something in the right direction, you can benefit. But also, as soon as it becomes more popular to look at, I'll just stop looking at it entirely, because you'll just get people making decisions solely based on that, when really it's a very, very small bump to a projection.
That was the other thing that we talked about on Monday, and I got to give some credit to Matt Butler, was the one who reached out to me and was like, hey, you should really take a closer look at these numbers. And he said, because he doesn't think that they are included, like it's not a factor in projections. Projections don't factor in these numbers, which is the same thing that you said on Monday. How confident are you that projections are not factoring this in? Because I've never done my own projections. I don't know if you've taken Brick's course, watched his video on how to do projections. So I guess I've never really known like how often projections are done top down versus bottom up. Bottom up being like you look at rates, you adjust whatever based on that, versus top down being like you look at Vegas lines, which I would imagine with Vegas lines, at least they would factor that kind of thing in. I don't know how good of a sense do you have that these things are not factored into general projections around the industry?
So I obviously don't know for sure because I haven't seen what goes into any of them. My pretty strong assumption is that they're not for a couple of reasons. For one, like you said, everything is tied pretty heavily to Vegas stuff, which will move you in the right direction, but it's still not accounting for like the granular details necessarily because obviously Vegas isn't actually like predicting like if your sharpest people that are setting lines in Vegas think that this guy's in a really good matchup for whatever coverage reason, they're still not going to set the line like necessarily all the way as high as it would.
Right.
Would they think it's going to be? But in general, it's the same kind of thing where I think like in baseball, for example, you'll get this team projects really well because they have a high implied run total, but there's not a lot you can actually get an edge by like digging into like okay, but when they score 6 runs in this park, is it likely to be by home run? Is it likely to be by single and double? Like it's not all equal for fantasy purposes. And so I think there's a gap there, even though because things are adjusted to Vegas, they're going to be close. But also, and I don't mean this negatively towards anyone, I would have a very hard time believing that it's baked into or that it's included in projections because most sites have like their stuff is all generated, algorithmically
yeah.
and then adjusted. I don't think anybody is going in that closely and adjusting things. And their models were built long enough ago that this data wasn't even publicly available. There's no incentive for these sites that already have 1 million subscribers to take the time and resources to go back and redo their entire models just to add in like coverage data that came out 2 years ago or whatever. So I do feel pretty strongly that, or assume pretty strongly that they're not included. Again, it's not part of the reason they're not included is because I don't think it makes a huge difference in a projection either. But yeah, I'm pretty confident they're not.
Okay, that was the other factor that for me it's like, yeah, if it's not included, that gives me more incentive to dig in further. And that's we always come back to, I often say like, well, I think a lot of this stuff is included in the projection. A lot of the things that we talk about like go into the projections, but yeah, things that don't go into projections, like when we are fighting for the tiniest little edges we can find at this point in DFS, because projections are generally so good, like that seems worth it to me to dig in a little bit more, at least with the outlier teams where it's like the top of the league or the bottom of the league in man coverage percentage. Those are the places where like, yeah, I want to lean on those spots where I can get an advantage on the Simbros, the Optos, etc.
I always think about it because obviously again I have more of like a NBA DFS background, but I always think about it. I don't know if the site exists anymore, but there was a site called like 3ball.io, and you could actually go in and see like every single field goal attempt. You can see it on the NBA site now, but anyway, you would get the same kind of thing. Like players on this team might project well because the game has a high total, but you would get like the Bucks, for example, years ago used to intentionally, because of their defensive scheme, leave open spot up 3-point shooters. And so you would just get, they project well because of the game environment, but they actually should project even a little bit better because if you go back and look at the shots these guys get, not only are they getting a couple of extra possessions because of the pace, but their field goal percentage is just going to go up in that matchup because they're getting wide open threes as opposed to what they normally get. So I think, kind of have the same thing in NFL where if you know the sport and really can pay attention and follow and have an idea of what defenses are going to do against specific offenses, I do think you can say, okay, well, this receiver is probably going to get an extra target or two, and he's probably going to be a little bit more efficient because the defense is intentionally going to let him, basically.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, it's a good discussion. I think worth having that conversation because it's going to affect how we do things in the future, and just a good thing to talk about in general. Because I was clearly a little bit misplaced with some of my assumptions the last time we had the conversation, so wanted to bring that up again. But I know people showed up mostly to talk about this slate, so we'll get into it a little bit. Jets Patriots again should be a pretty ugly game. Ugly from an offensive standpoint, at least. Should be very slow paced. Aaron Rodgers, the slowest paced quarterback in the league once again, according to Pat Thorman. Jacoby Brissett just not very good so far this year in 2 games. I think his better fantasy game, he put up 10 fantasy points, the other one 8 fantasy points, just has not done a ton. Now they're both facing very good defenses. Aaron Rodgers still projects for 15.6 fantasy points at 10,000. Suddenly the quarterback salaries look more reasonable on this slate than they have in some recent slates. That 10,000 doesn't seem that crazy. 9,000 on Jacoby Brissett doesn't seem all that crazy. Starting with Aaron Rodgers, Adam, how big of a factor do you think Aaron Rodgers is going to play in your lineups tonight?
Pretty big, probably. Obviously, he's the quarterback that you prefer between the two. Not a lot of rushing upside. He is relatively expensive, so not the same level of priority, for example, as somebody like Jalen Hurts was. Obviously, it's a lot easier to envision games where even if the Jets do score points and do relatively well, Rodgers isn't somebody you have to have. But he does show up as being optimal more often than Brissett for me at 10K. He's in the flex about 50% of the time on DraftKings, about 6% at captain. So right now the field's projected to pretty much have him nailed at captain. I do think they're slightly low at flex, but for the most part, I think the field pretty much got it right. Like, he's still a quarterback. He's still got weapons on his team. It's not a great matchup. They have played at a slow pace, like you said. So I don't think it's the same sort of slam dunk play like we've seen for other quarterbacks. Also, just a lower total in this game. Again, just kind of because of all the things I just said. So still looks good. Doesn't look as good as some other quarterbacks.
I don't know if I started using this when we did our show on Monday or not until Monday evening, but I do have access to the Roto Grinders data here. So we can look at their projected ownership as a source here. And yeah, we have Roto Grinder says that Aaron Rodgers about 40% projected ownership in the flex. I look at it. I separate flex and captain, so not looking at captain just yet, but I think it's around 5% around the industry for Aaron Rodgers in the captain spot. Feels a little bit light. Going to be probably around 50% owned overall, not knowing the exact numbers. I would also say Aaron Rodgers, definitely a quarterback that I'm always stacking up no matter where I have him in my lineup. If I have him in the captain spot, I prefer to have multiple pass catchers with Aaron Rodgers because of the scoring dynamics. Doesn't really run a lot, so all of his fantasy points are accumulated through the air, and on every passing attempt he gets outscored by his receivers. Really easy for his receivers to outscore him if the passing attack is too concentrated to one receiver. So if Aaron Rodgers is the optimal captain, most of the time it's going to be with multiple pass catchers in the flex. That's how I prefer to play it. Adam, looking at your sims, is that kind of bearing out? Do you think that's what you are seeing when you have Rodgers in the captain spot?
Most likely, with the caveat that Breece Hall is absolutely included as a pass catcher in this conversation for me. Breece Hall is actually showing up the most frequently when Rodgers is captain, 78% of the time. Garrett Wilson's next at 55%. Then it drops off, but it's still pretty spread out. Allen Lazard, Conklin, Braylon Allen, Mike Williams, all like 25 to 35% roughly. So yeah, I do think, obviously you want to be playing pass catchers with Rodgers. I do think Breece Hall is one of those options.
Oh, yeah.
That's not just limited to wide receiver tight end.
That's definitely a good call up. Breece Hall definitely qualifies as a pass catcher. Braylon Allen, we did see get a receiving touchdown in the last game. Doesn't appear to be that great of a pass catcher. I just watched his plays from the last game. Seemed like he had at least 2 to 3 drops on pretty low volume. So it doesn't seem like Braylon Allen was holding up as a pass catcher. At least that was one game that I watched against the Titans, but I don't know how much he is going to be involved as a pass catcher in general. Probably not high enough volume that I would include him as a stacking partner with Rodgers, if as the only stacking partner with Rodgers, I guess is what I mean. Bridge Lion says Aaron Rodgers had more rushing yards than Goff. I'm not gonna fact check you. I'm guessing that means Goff had negative rushing yards because I believe Aaron Rodgers has 3 rushing attempts for 0 yards so far on the season.
Yeah, I was gonna say I wasn't sure because I don't know how many rushing yards Rodgers has. I don't know how many Goff had, but I was gonna ask why Jared Goff was the
right.
for quarterback rushing yards.
Not exactly Lamar Jackson out there. Yeah, that probably means Jared Goff has negative rushing yards.
Yeah, because when I first read it, I thought it was like a comment like, "Oh, these guys don't know what they're talking about. Rodgers has more yards than so and so."
Oh no,
like, Jared Goff.
No, I think the laughing emoji is. I think he's making a joke. I do want to answer this question. Would it be crazy to play Henry and Hooper in the same lineup on FanDuel? I don't think so at all. They are, I think, the 2 leading pass catchers for the Patriots so far this year. I don't expect that to continue the entire year, but I think Henry has just been Hunter Henry has been the leading pass catcher so far for the Patriots. That role could just continue. He could be like the number 1 option on the Patriots, and Hooper going to score a one-off touchdown. So in a low-scoring game, I don't think that's too crazy at all. Adam, what do you think?
No, I mean, and in general in Showdown, I have a hard time usually saying like I wouldn't play this guy with that guy, because what also ends up happening, and you and I have kind of touched on it before too, is obviously there are guys that you would rather not play with other guys, and 2 tight ends are a perfect example of that. But the further the like more clear that distinction is, where you quote unquote shouldn't play those guys together, the more likely you are to have a unique lineup. and it's still a 1-game sample size where, like you were saying, Henry could be the leading receiver and Austin Hooper steals a touchdown, or 2 catches, 2 touchdowns, has like the Yosivas game from the other day.
Yeah.
And you still need them both. And so, no, I don't want them together, but also I think they're perfectly fine to play together.
Yeah. Rob Live, we got this question last week, so I guess we should answer this. I don't use Sims currently in Showdown. I like to use an optimizer just because I have different player takes often than I think the Sims, and it just becomes more messy than just using an optimizer. I kind of know that the kind of lineups it wants to give me anyway, so I prefer just using an optimizer. Adam, how about you?
I use SaberSim right now.
Yep, and somebody had asked that question last week, so I thought I would give you that answer. And you like the lineups it gives you for Showdown?
Yeah, for everything. Like, it takes a while to use. It's definitely, or to learn rather. It's definitely not like you're going to sign up and click a button and be really, really happy with what you get. But you have the ability to do pretty much whatever you want once you figure out how to use it. And so, like to your point, it's very, very easy once you've played around with it and everything to like be able to get the inputs that you're putting in to do whatever you want it to do, whether it's through rules like in an optimizer or just adjusting things on your end. So I like it. I love it for every sport. I started using it as soon as it came out last summer and haven't stopped.
Yeah, I probably should be using it because, like, objectively, it's going to give better lineups, like as a whole, than like the lineups that if I crunch 150, I'm going to get some negative EV lineups in there. Whereas, at least in theory, it should give me, more positive EV lineups than what I'm probably spitting out with an optimizer. I usually don't have a ton of time, and I do like to tinker quite a bit. So currently it's easier for me to tinker with an optimizer than it is with Sims. But yeah, I did use it like I use SaberSim for UFL and had pretty good results using SaberSim with UFL. So it's definitely not like an anti-Sims take by me. I think Sims are extremely valuable, and most people could benefit from using them. I know the types of lineups I want to play in Showdown, and I find it easier to get those lineups by using an optimizer so far, in part probably just because I have not mastered the Sims just yet. So
and to that point, actually both of our points about it being something you want to take the time to learn, and your point also, like, for Showdown specifically, I don't play a lot of large field. Partly, I haven't put the time into trying to figure it out, but I don't think there's anything really that I've used or seen that is available that does a good job of handling dupes without a lot of figuring out on your own, figuring out how to either replicate that in the field that you're simming against, or the same way that you would with an optimizer, using rules. So like you're not using the full salary cap, and you're not, you're doing a lot of things to counteract it. So it's not like a knock on SaberSim or anything. I don't think it exists anywhere in the market right now, something that like really handles dupes well as like default settings. And I haven't taken the time to actually figure out how to be good at it.
That has definitely been my experience with the Showdown stuff as well. It's usually they're not doing a field of 500,000 or whatever it is for the large field. They're not giving you a field of that size. So it really makes a ton of like rounding. Like it's basically rounding because the field size that they use is so small, and it can be off pretty significantly. Whereas like I have a pretty good idea of like how much salary do I need to leave on the table, or how weird do I need to get with my constructions. Now they're going to make it easier by just like, okay, well, you can use all the salary if you do this weird type of construction, or like this weird player combo. You can use more of your salary cap if you do that. They're probably going to be generally better at that than I am, but I would like a better calculator as far as calculating dupes on the Sims.
Yeah, I think it's just that default fields don't do a good job right now of actually accounting for like how heavily duplicated some of the best lineups are going to be. And then also probably because the field sizes aren't that big, like you were saying. A lot of times I think you'll get those like lineups that you would think are not going to be duped much if you're just using like ownership product, but they still end up being duped a lot because it's like, yeah, it has a 2% guy, but the only time you're playing that 2% guy is because of this one specific lineup.
Yep.
And so it ends up still being duped like 35 times. But in a lot of Sims, I think it kind of just comes out as, oh, this is a really good lineup. And then everybody plays it, 35 times.
Yep, exactly. Jake DeWitt says, seems like Anguilla or whatever his DK tag is really good at minimizing dupes in Showdown. I mean, it's not that difficult to minimize dupes in Showdown. The difficult part, and this is not a comment on Anguilla. I'm sure he makes great lineups. But the difficult part is playing good lineups that also are on dupe. So it's like, yeah, you can leave $5,000 on the table and you're not going to be duped all that much generally in Showdown. But making lineups that still have a really good shot, project well enough, and don't dupe a ton. That's the real skill involved in Showdown.
We were talking about that on the Endgame roundtable the other day, Nerdy and Brick and I. And I think me and Nerdy kind of ended up on the same page because I've never been one that is like really aiming for uniques as far as like literally one. Yeah. Because I think that the margin there is so small where like everybody understands uniques are good. There's a lot of really good DFS players. If I'm actually finding a ton of lineups that nobody else is playing, I'm not the smartest person in the room, so I'm probably playing a lot of shitty lineups. Where if like I play a lineup and it's duped 5 times, but it's by B. Kreider and Utica and 2 other really good players, I probably played a really good lineup, and that's about as good as.
Yep, then you're happy with that. If you're duped 4 times and that those are the people you're duping with, that is a solid lineup. This is a good point from Sacriletus. Providing a publicly available tool to predict dupes is a snake eating its own tail problem. That is a really good point, especially when you're trying to deal with 4 or 5 dupes. Then it's like, okay, you give that lineup to too many people. Suddenly, that's a lot of people playing that same lineup or similar types of lineups. So that is a good point. That makes it kind of difficult for the Sims.
You get a similar feedback loop like you are now with industry ownership projections now that everybody's using Sims, combined with industry ownership projections. You project the players to be higher owned, then they're going to be lower owned. You project them to be low owned, then high owned.
Yep, exactly. All right, so the other quarterback that we have not talked about yet, of course, is Jacoby Brissett, projected for just 11.2 fantasy points. That would be his highest output, I believe, so far this season, if he does get to 11.2 fantasy points. So it's not been pretty so far. Now he's facing the Jets. I'll give you a preview that I kind of like him. I'm probably going to be playing a lot of Jacoby Brissett, but also I'm not sure if that's the right play because he has been pretty bad this year. Adam, how much Jacoby Brissett are you getting to in your lineups?
Like the exact same amount as the field.
Okay.
He's projected for like 30.5% flex ownership right now. He showed up in 30.5% of my lineups, 4% captain ownership, 3% of my lineups. So I think it's, like you said, he's not exciting. He's actually playing pretty well, I think, from like an actual standpoint. That line is really, really bad, and he's still managing to find ways to not get killed and not stall out the offense. That doesn't really translate to a ton of fantasy production. He's not super expensive, though, is the other thing. Like he's only 9K, whereas quarterbacks are usually going to be more expensive. So still a perfectly reasonable play, but not anywhere close, I don't think, to the level of priority that a lot of other quarterbacks are. I think he's firmly behind Rodgers here. To kind of, I guess, put it in context too, just how this game projects to play out. Jacoby Brissett is showing up as optimal for me, the same frequency as the Jets defense.
Can you still hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you.
Yeah, I think that was just I don't know what happened. Oh wait, start cam. It says that it was unplugged. All right,
now you're a black screen.
All right.
Well, I saw you for a second, like you flickered on and then went away. Now you're back.
So now I don't have my camera on. Something happened that says, look like your camera was unplugged. My camera was not unplugged though, so I don't know what is happening there.
I used to have that issue a lot, and I think normally would have to restart or leave and come back.
All right, I won't do that to you. I will just use my computer camera for the rest of this stream. I don't think people are really watching me that closely anyway. I don't think it makes a huge difference. Yeah, it's he's coming in a little bit higher today than I only had one projection source really available last night in terms of projected ownership, and I think he was even lower than this. But now it looks like he's coming in at 34% projected ownership in the flex. And then at captain, I'm just going to look at this real quick. At captain, we have Jacoby Brissett coming in at 6% projected ownership, and Aaron Rodgers, for those curious, projected for 7% projected ownership. So really low ownership going to the quarterbacks in the captain spot. Yeah, I think that I will use. I'm at least intrigued by the idea because I feel like nobody wants to play Jacoby Brissett, and of course now we do have now these numbers look more reasonable to me than I was expecting. I was expecting like 2% captain ownership for Brissett, I guess, because there are so few great plays that they are the like decent plays are getting kind of bumped up in terms of projected ownership. So I guess that does make some sense. I don't know. I was going to come in here with a hot take that I really love Jacoby Brissett at captain with multiple pass catchers. And I'm kind of doubting myself now because the field is coming in higher, but I still think I like the idea. I still think that also the projected ownership could be wrong because I don't see a lot of people really wanting to click Jacoby Brissett in captain. The reason that I have some interest in it is just looking at his game logs from 2 years ago. So he started the first 11 games 2 years ago for the Browns. He had, I think he scored double-digit points in every single one of those 11 games and put up at least 15 in like 7 of 11, something like that. And they weren't all high volume. Like a lot of the time it was just, 24 pass attempts. It wasn't like he was throwing 40 times a game. So not all that different. So even though he's been bad this year, I'm like, well, you look at the larger recent sample, he actually wasn't that bad from a, fantasy points per game standpoint. He isn't a complete zero in terms of running. He doesn't run a lot. I think he's averaging 19 rush yards per game so far this year. He again that season I was just talking about 2 years ago had a couple rushing touchdowns. He is a big guy who you can imagine just getting that goal line carry. Of course, Ramondre Stevenson is there too, so I don't know how much they want to go to Brissett, but I think that there are paths there for Brissett to put up a surprising score, and I think given how bad he's been so far this year, people just don't want to play him. Also, given the fact that New England does have the lowest pass rate in neutral situations in the NFL right now. They have the highest rush rate. So there's a lot of, I can see why people aren't excited to play Jacoby Brissett. But on a 1-game sample, I'm sort of inclined to just play it like, well, what if they just have a couple of broken plays against this? I know it's a very good Jets defense, but the NFL, weird stuff happens all the time. So just leaning into that uncertainty with a quarterback who, is going to have opportunities. I have some interest in Brissett as captain, just a very contrarian captain option. What do you think of that reasoning, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's showing up like 3 to 4% for me. I think it's fine. I think because the paths for him at captain, I guess he could just go out there and throw 4 touchdowns, but like realistically, you're probably, I would think, looking more for a game that is low scoring, defense heavy. Maybe Brissett gets like a goal line touchdown, or throws for a touchdown, but like the Jets for whatever reason scored like 3 points, and Brissett just kind of ends up landing in the optimal lineup with like a low score. So like I think you could see that. I was trying to look to see. So with him at captain, he's paired with Breece Hall a lot, which I think makes sense. Like Breece Hall is kind of game script agnostic, I think. Ramondre's in there like half the time. Pop Douglas, Gibson. Not a lot of guys showing up with a high frequency. So very, very spread out. So I guess it kind of, to me, again, goes back to what I was saying, where in my head, for him to succeed at captain a lot of the time, there's just like a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different players that do well enough in those games to be optimal, but overall the game is probably pretty messy. It's probably not a game where, anybody's having like really great games.
Yep. No, that is a big factor. Is just like, we're expecting this to be a low scoring game. So if he happens to be involved in those outlier splash plays, then suddenly he's going to look really good. And obviously as a quarterback, he'll have more opportunities to be involved in those big splash plays. So that's kind of the reasoning for sort of liking him. It's not that I expect him to put up 25 fantasy points or 30 fantasy points. It's that even if he puts up 18 fantasy points, has just a slight outlier performance, that could be enough to be the optimal captain. It's not extremely likely. He's not like a player that I'm jamming into lineups, but some interest there just because it could be a very low scoring game. I don't know what DDoS means. I know this is like computer terminology from Sack here, but I've seen it. I've seen it before. I don't know what that means, Sack, though.
I don't remember what it stands for, but he was saying he was trying to attack your computer.
Oh, I know.
You lost your camera.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's funny. I thought he was talking about his question. Okay, now I get it now. Okay.
And Brissett, okay, you are a little older.
That's funny. I am slightly older than Adam. I mean, I'm like what, 6-7 years older than you. I guess it's not, it's not just a few like it is with some. Brissett does, as I said, he runs a little bit more than Rodgers. I would be okay, I think, playing him in the flex without any pass catchers. Not my preference. I generally still want to be pairing him with pass catchers. In general, I'm going to be stacking Brissett because, again, not an elite rusher, but in a potentially low scoring game, just like one rushing touchdown, he could be optimal without bringing along any pass catchers. So I don't totally hate the idea of playing him in the flex sometimes without any pass catchers. In the and similarly in the captain spot, I don't hate the idea of sometimes playing him with just one pass catcher. Still never going to play him with 0 pass catchers in the captain spot, but potentially one. Is that kind of what you're seeing, Adam?
Yeah, and I think that all makes sense. When you're talking about him in the flex, again, it could just be he has more fantasy points than most of the receivers in this game because the game ends up being low scoring. So it's like him, defenses, kickers, Breece Hall, something. That could obviously work. And also, it's not really an offense where I think you necessarily need him, or a game where I think you necessarily need him with multiple pass catchers, even if he's the captain. Because, could he throw multiple touchdowns to different guys? Sure. But you're not necessarily assuming that even when he is the captain, that this game is super high scoring. It could just be that he throws a touchdown to Hunter Henry and that's enough, or he throws 2 touchdowns to Hunter Henry and that's enough. So it's not an offense where, like, on the one hand, there's not one dominant receiver, so it could easily just end up being spread out and multiple pass catchers do well. But it's not an offense where I'm looking at it and saying, like, I really want Amon-Ra St. Brown, and I really want Jameson Williams, and I really like Sam Laporta. Like, I think a high percentage of the time that he's captain, you still aren't going to need to have overdone it with his pass catchers. And that goes back to, my overall point too, where when I look at who shows up most frequently at flex when he's captain, Pop Douglas 40, or Stevenson 54%, Pop Douglas 47, Gibson 47. Then it drops off to like 33 for Osborne, 24 for Polk, obviously 13 for Henry. Obviously, you can argue about the correct ranking of Patriots receivers, but
sure.
You can put Polk where Osborne is, for example, but it doesn't really matter to the overall point.
Yep, that's true. Question from Javad. I've been watching the past few videos. Where are those projections from? So the ones that are on the page right now, this is from Fantasy Points. And when I look at things like advanced receiving data, bell cow report, all of this is Fantasy Points. You can find it at fantasypoints.com. If you want to sign up for the data suite or the NFL premium package where you get access to the projections, you can use promo code Flannelman to get 25% off whichever product. If you're interested in checking out Fantasy Points tools, you can use, again, promo code Flannelman for those. I also have this one, the Opto, which also has projections in it, is the Roto Grinders Opto. You can get this for $10 off any, like the NFL package or the all-inclusive package. If you want $10 off either of those, you can find the link in the description of this video. So those are the 2 projection sources that I am showing here. All right, we've gotten through quarterbacks. Let's move on and talk about running backs. And Breece Hall, the highest projected player on the slate by a landslide, seems like a pretty solid play here. Adam, I'll just throw it to you. What is your level of interest? What percentage of your lineups are you getting Breece Hall in, or are you comfortable getting Breece Hall in?
So from an optimal standpoint, he's showing up optimal as either the flex or the captain about 80% of the time. And it goes back to what I said a second ago, where I think he's kind of just game script agnostic too. Yep. Barring injury, it's hard to envision how this game plays out where Breece Hall isn't one of the best plays just because he's so involved as a pass catcher too. So even if the game's low scoring and maybe he doesn't get into the end zone and the Patriots defense does well in that type of game, he's still probably one of the best players just off of receptions and opportunities with how heavily he's been involved for the Jets. If it is a high scoring game, obviously he's likely to be involved in that too. So it's really difficult for him just not to show up one way or the other. I do think he's going quite a bit under-owned at captain and as a result over-owned at flex. He's showing up at captain 36% of the time for me. Fields only projected right now around 28%, 54% projected flex ownership. He's showing up 43% in the flex for me. So I do think that's a distinction where he's just showing up at captain a lot. There's nobody being paired with him in those lineups where he is optimal at captain more than 46% of the time, which is Aaron Rodgers. 46% Rodgers, 45% Wilson, 40% Jets are the top 3. So it does also give you, like we were talking about on a show the other day, I don't remember who the running back question was, but it is nice too, because it just, when you have that running back at captain, because it could work out in a variety of ways, it does sort of open the door for you to be creative with the rest of your lineup. It doesn't create the situation that you get with like Aaron Rodgers, where it's like, okay, well, if Aaron Rodgers is captain, then I kind of have to have Garrett Wilson and or Breece Hall, and everybody else is going to do that too. So now I'm down to 3 spots in my lineup where I'm trying to get different in the field. With Breece Hall, even though he's going to be popular at captain, it does open the door for you to get more creative with the rest of your lineup and try and avoid some dupes that way.
Yep, and That's the weird thing with Breece Hall, where it's like, okay, I want to play this as though, it's a slowed down game, and so maybe play some of those players that nobody else is playing at low ownership because like one splash play can get it done. But Breece Hall is so involved in this offense that he's such a hard fade because, as you can see here, 14 targets through 2 games with Aaron Rodgers, and I think that's going to continue. I think Aaron Rodgers is just going to dump it off a ton all season. So if he's going to get 14 targets a game on top of 15 rushing attempts so far. 14 targets, 7 targets per game, 15 rushing attempts. Like the usage is so good for Breece Hall, and as you point out, game script dependent. It's really hard to find reasons to fade Breece Hall. If he's healthy, he's probably going to be in the winning lineup in what should be a low scoring game. As Ted says, will 6 players have double-digit fantasy points? I'm not sure. Yeah, me neither. This could be a game where just like it's really not a high scoring DFS slate. Now, I've said that many times before, and it's gone the complete opposite direction. We get surprised all the time in NFL games, but this is one that I would expect to be low scoring. So that's just raw score for Breece Hall, even if it is 14 fantasy points and he's not that great from a point per dollar standpoint, you probably still want him.
Yeah, and also with Breece Hall, like even if this does end up being the game where it's just like, wow, it was 35-28, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah,
Breece Hall probably still had a really good game. It's not like, this isn't a run, a first and second down running back where you're saying like, I think he has value in this game because it's going to be ugly and it's going to be 9-7 and they're going to just be, running clock, not being able to throw the ball, all of that. Even if they are able to move the ball and throw the ball, that still benefits Breece Hall. And to the point about 6 players having double-digit fantasy points, I only have 5 projected for double-digit fantasy points.
I was actually just about to bring that up. So I do a write-up for every Showdown slate. Did it all of last year. I think this is the first time where I do like a stud section where I recommend playing at least 3 players from this group of players because they just project. Usually there's kind of a gap after a certain number of players. Usually it's like 7 or 8 players that project well enough that I include them in the stud section. This week it was 5, only 5 players that project well at all, as you point out, as both quarterbacks: Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, Ramondre Stevenson. I don't know that I've seen this yet on any Showdown slate that I've had to do a write-up on, where it's like such a clear distinction between these 5 and everybody else. So I still, in my article, I went back and forth on should I change this from include at least 3 to include at least 2, which I have done that a couple times in the past. I kept it at 3 because I still think you probably are going to get 3 players from that group in the winning lineup. I don't know though. I'm not super confident in that. Do you still think it's generally going to be? Do you think a majority of your lineups are going to have at least 3 of Jacoby Brissett, Aaron Rodgers, Ramondre Stevenson, Breece Hall, and Garrett Wilson?
Probably, because they still do just project so much better than everybody else, and they're still. It's an opportunity thing. Like raw points do still matter. Because it's a 1-game slate, so it's not Garrett Wilson didn't do well enough for his salary. As long as he scores more fantasy points than almost every other player in the game, he did well enough for his salary.
Right.
So probably still very heavily around those guys.
Yep, same. The second best running back projection, Ramondre Stevenson, 16.7 fantasy points is the projection. He is 11,400, so only 400 cheaper than Breece Hall. Projects 5.5 fantasy points worse than Breece Hall. You look at the bell cow report in terms of just expected fantasy points for all running backs on the season. Ramondre Stevenson, number 2 on the list. Breece Hall is actually number 7. So more expected fantasy points on the season for Ramondre Stevenson, just given 8 targets so far this year. Also 46 rushing attempts, 23 rushing attempts, and 4 targets per game. Incredible usage so far for Ramondre Stevenson. But this projection, relative to Breece Hall, looks not that great. How much Ramondre Stevenson are you getting, Adam?
Yeah, less than Breece Hall, but I still have him projected as the 3rd highest scorer, just ahead of Aaron Rodgers. The opportunities have been great. I think that the big concern for Stevenson going forward is this line is terrible. I think I actually saw today that he has more yards after contact than before.
Yep, I saw that too. Yep.
I can't find where I had put the stat yesterday. I tweeted it out. It was actually a tweet about Javonte Williams, but Ramondre Stevenson is running into boxes of 8+ defenders at the 4th highest rate so far this year because teams don't have to worry about the Patriots beating them through the air. On top of that, the line is horrible. I have big concerns about his efficiency going forward, but that's not a huge concern tonight because for one, the opportunities, are still there and you're going to overcome efficiency issues through opportunity a lot of the time, but also it's a 1-game slate. So just like we were saying where, what if the game's really low scoring? Are you still playing these expensive guys? it's not like you have the option to just say, okay, well, I'm just going to pick a guy from a different game that plays running back at Stevenson's price. It doesn't exist. So just on the opportunities, he's still going to look very good here. Obviously, he's going to look worse than Breece Hall for a variety of reasons, including the ones that I just said, but still only have him projected behind Hall and Wilson, basically the same as Rodgers, but slightly ahead of him. Still have him showing up as optimal about 50% of the time, which is lower than Rodgers because he is more expensive. I think he's pretty much correctly owned at captain at about 12 to 13%. I think he's going a little bit over owned at flex. I have him optimal 37%, fields at 44. So maybe getting a little bit more ownership than I think he deserves from an optimal standpoint, but still just clearly one of the best plays solely because of opportunity.
Yep. Just great usage there for Ramondre Stevenson. Again, going to be part of that 5 that are going to be a core part of most of my lineups. Just projects so well. And again, 8 targets. So like somewhat game script independent. I don't think he's as game script independent as Breece Hall is because they do have Antonio Gibson there as well. But just looking at these numbers, I thought Antonio Gibson was going to be used a lot more as a passing down back for the Patriots, going to be kind of their pass catching back. So far, just 7 routes run and 1 target for Antonio Gibson. Does that surprise you as much as it surprised me, Adam?
Yeah, it surprises me a lot, especially in the context of last week where so week 1, Gibson just wasn't really involved doing anything. And he had, I think it was turf toe. I don't remember what it was, but he'd had an injury in the preseason. So I didn't read too much into Stevenson's workload compared to Gibson in week 1. But last week we saw Gibson get an increased workload compared to week 1, but it was mostly on the ground. He went from an 18% rushing share in week 1 to 30.5% last week. Mostly that was Jacoby Brissett's rushing percentage going down more so than Stevenson's. But Gibson ran routes on 10% of dropbacks week 1, only 13% last week. So even when he was on the field more and getting the ball more, it wasn't in that role. Stevenson still ran routes about 70% of the time last week. So going forward, yeah, maybe we do see Gibson more involved, but it does seem like for now, at least, Stevenson is actually the pass catching guy.
Yeah, it's pretty strange. Not the expectation coming in, but so far it has been Stevenson in that role. So let's talk about those backups a little bit. And Braylon Allen, probably going to be one of my bigger stances on the slate is fading Braylon Allen at expected high ownership. Did score 2 touchdowns the last game, 1 rushing touchdown, 1 receiving touchdown. I think he's going to come in and let me double check the ownership here before I get too deep into this because everything could have changed here with Braylon Allen. No, still projected for 27% ownership here at Roto Grinders. I don't know if you're seeing similar projected ownership elsewhere, Adam, but at that ownership at 5,200, like I don't think that he is necessarily the goal line back. Neither of the touchdowns that he scored last week were goal line touches. They were both, 10 plus yards out. It was kind of Rodgers finding him seemingly in a desperation situation, dumped it down to Braylon Allen. He scored 1, took another one from more than 10 yards out. He's been great so far this year. So it's not a knock on the talent, but the role has not actually been that elite so far for Braylon Allen. It's not like he is a big part of this offense. It's just he happened to score 2 touchdowns last week. And honestly, I don't know that 1 touchdown would be enough for Braylon Allen to pay off this price tag, given his role as 8 carries on the year. He does have 5 targets on 26.6% route participation. So that is pretty strong targets for Braylon. He's dropped at least 2, maybe 3 of those 5 targets. I don't know, 11.1 expected fantasy points so far in the year. He has more than doubled that with 22.3 fantasy points. To me, this is a trap. I could definitely see it kicking me, but it feels like a trap to me. Do you feel the same way, Adam, or are you leaning into it?
Sort of. The pushback I'd have on using his year-to-date stats is that he was non-existent mostly in week 1 and played a much bigger role last week. He had a 5% rushing share week 1, 29% week 2, and that came basically straight from Breece Hall. And I think is probably pretty likely to continue going forward just because Allen has looked really good going back to the preseason. Hall had an 84% rushing share week 1. That just seems like something that isn't going to hold up. It makes sense, to have Hall in that like 60-ish percent range, maybe 65, 70%, with Allen getting work as opposed to Allen just not getting any. And then ran routes on 23% of dropbacks week 1, 30% last week. So you saw the increase just in playing time in general, in opportunities. So for me, it still comes back to the ownership. Like right now, I have him projected at like 20%, which I think is about correct, maybe a little bit too low. You said 27, which I was going to say, because he did score twice last week and you have that recency bias, this is a spot where I wouldn't be surprised at all if ownership projections are just low. in which case I wouldn't like Allen as much, obviously. So like at 20%, I think he's fine. It's again just not difficult to envision a game where a guy that gets 30% of the carries for the Jets and a few targets ends up being optimal at 5,200 in a game that probably isn't going to have a lot of fantasy points. He does have touchdown equity, even though I agree that I don't think he's by design just taking touchdowns away from Breece Hall anytime soon. So the paths are obviously there. I am really encouraged by the increased participation last week, given just how positive reports on him had been in the preseason.
Yeah.
And then the fact that, week one, he wasn't involved. And there is just that it's week one. A lot of times rookies that end up being big pieces aren't involved. So you saw him take that step forward. He played well. I assume he's not going to just disappear again. So I think he looks pretty good, but I do have concerns that from a narrative standpoint, ownership might just end up being a lot higher than people are thinking.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. Looking at the splits from week 1 to week 2, that is kind of not that shocking to see him take on a bigger role. As you can see here, just 1.9 expected fantasy points in week 1, 9.2 in week 2, which even though he had the outlier performance and put up 19.6, you're convincing me a little bit that maybe I should be more afraid of the fade than I am, because 9.2, again, getting back to the 9.2 at 5,200, not very good, but also might be good enough in this particular game. Like on this slate, if he does just do what he's expected to based on his role last week, that might be enough at 5,200. So as much as I want to full fade him and just be like, he needs to at least score a touchdown to bury me, which I think is true. But maybe it was just 1 and not 2 touchdowns that he needs to bury me. That scares me a lot more. And as we talked about, like, he has not been used as that goal line back so far, but also that was, something that we thought about coming in, is he's a big bruising back. He might at some point just be the goal line back too. So does definitely have outs there.
Yeah. And also just thinking about it from a slate specific context, when you look at the players priced around him, there's plenty of other players that are going to be involved, but there's nobody really around him where I look and I'm like, I definitely like that guy more. Greg Zuerlein is 5K, Jets defense 5,400. Like, they both project better for me by a little bit. But that is also very game dependent, where, if we're just wrong about how this game plays out, obviously you're expecting less field goals and less defense and more Braylon Allen. But then, Allen Lazard, 600 more with his, losing routes to Mike Williams. You have Pop Douglas, Antonio Gibson are both cheaper. I certainly don't have confidence in any individual New England pass catcher. So it's, I have more confidence in Braylon Allen, at least like producing with the ball in his opportunities, than I do anybody priced around him.
Yeah, and he over 5 yards per carry so far this year, just 8 carries on the year, but over 40 yards. That's all really promising. Was an exciting prospect. So maybe I'm, I wanted to just lean into it and full fade it because he's so expensive for somewhat of a limited role. But that is, you make a good point about the bump in usage last week. I had actually not looked at splits there. I looked at the week 1 versus 2 splits for receivers. So now I'm less inclined to full fade him. I still think I'm going to be lighter than the field if the field is at 27% or even 20%. I'm not sure that I'm going to get above that. But
I mean, that's where I'm at too. Like, I didn't want that to come off as like a huge ringing endorsement on Allen.
Yeah, I know.
If I used your ownership numbers, I would have him as one of the most overowned guys on the slate.
Right.
Using mine, I have him slightly underowned. So the truth, probably somewhere in the middle. But again, you do have that narrative factor too, where he just had a massive game. People want to play him. Like, he's definitely somebody that's fun to click,
exciting,
as opposed to guys on the Patriots. I do think that's a good point in chat too, about if the Jets do just run away with this game. It's not like, it's not the most likely case, obviously, but like, the further apart the score in this game is down the stretch, the more likely the Jets are to just let their 20-year-old rookie touch the ball.
Yeah, you've kind of convinced me, or you've, I know you're not trying to have a ringing endorsement, but you have given me enough thought to like, maybe I can't just full fade this guy. As I was thinking like, this might be the rare spot where he's getting so much ownership that maybe I can just full fade him for a guy who doesn't have that big of a role. But I had not done the split it out game 1 versus game 2, which I think is important to do, as you say, especially for rookies where like the roles change pretty quickly. I did that for receivers, had not done that for the running back. So that's a good note. Probably can't full fade him. And then we talked about Antonio Gibson a little bit, but let's go back to Gibson. You can see here I've broken this down by week and opponent, so we can kind of get a game log here. That's why you're seeing the names twice here. Antonio Gibson, though, just 6.6 expected fantasy points in which week is this? Week 2, and then week one, even lower at 3.4 expected fantasy points. Just does not have a great role. 7 total routes on the year so far. But also, I think the same thing applies here. Do you think Antonio Gibson would get more run in a blowout? Like if the Pats are getting blown out, do you think they go to Antonio Gibson? Maybe he does see, like, that was sort of the thesis in best ball, was like, oh well, they're going to be playing from behind a lot. Antonio Gibson will be that passing down back that they'll bring in. So I still think that could happen at some point, but also maybe they just, find Ramondre Stevenson to be too valuable that they don't want to use him in a blowout situation. Do you think there are paths for Antonio Gibson to have a big role here?
I'm less confident in that just because, I mean, I guess there's different degrees of blowout. Like if it's just a non-competitive game, I don't know. Maybe they just go to somebody further down the depth chart because it's not like Gibson is
right.
exactly
He's a veteran. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a veteran. He's just coming back from injury. He's not like, peak health or anything. Also, my best ball thesis on him was basically I just can't stop drafting this guy and I'm going to be right eventually. Going back to his Washington time, but
yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think at his price, he makes some sense. I do like that he did at least have a bigger role last week, especially because obviously he's not a rookie, but similar to how a lot of times you just get rookies in a limited role week one. You did have Gibson with the injury. There was a very easy explanation for why he just was non-existent week one. Then he got a bigger role last week. Does he get a bigger role this week from last week or the same role? I don't know. But there is at least some chance that, let's say week 5, week 6, you're looking back and going like, oh yeah, that was just a very natural progression for Gibson to cut into Stevenson's workload. I don't know if that's what they do or not. But there is at least a chance that he sees more work in this game. We don't know. And he is very cheap for that potential opportunity. Even if he does just end up getting the work he got last week, I wouldn't really love him then, since so much of that work was as a running back as opposed to a pass catcher. But he is a capable pass catcher. So again, that path is still there. I think at 3,600 in a game with a lot of really ugly offensive options, he's fine. I'm not super, optimistic about him or anything. I have him showing up optimal 23% of the time. Fields projected to play him 23% of the time. So I do like the price tag, relative to other options. And I like that we did see the increased role last week. But I do think it's important, especially because he did actually have a productive week. I think he ran for like 96 yards. I think it is important because I know like when I first saw, Gibson has 96 yards or whatever, I was like, oh, wow, he must have played a big role this week. He probably was out there as a pass catcher a lot. He wasn't playing the role that in your head you think Antonio Gibson plays when he does well.
Right. He has 18 carries so far in the year, which that kind of blew me away that he has 18 carries already as the backup running back, 9 carries per game, more than I kind of expected. 11 of those carries last week, as you noted, ran 4 routes versus 3. So just, minimal increases. But as you say, we could continue to see him ramped up a little bit into a bigger role. Probably like clearly still playing behind Ramondre Stevenson. Like Stevenson is the focal point of this offense. Gibson clearly in RB2, but could take on a little bit more of that workload going forward, given how much they do run too. There is a big pie there in New England. Again, the highest rush rate in neutral situations in the entire NFL. So there just is a big pie for the Patriots if they can sustain drives. They want to run a lot. So, at 3,600 feels like a pretty good price tag.
And I do think that's a really good point because, like, I know we've talked about it a lot. People in general talk about the split between whether it's targets or rushes or whatever. You talk about that as opportunities. I think there is a tendency to kind of focus on that and not take the step back and look at just the overall opportunities. Like 50% of 60 carries, is better than 60% of, a different smaller amount of carries.
40 carries.
Yeah, I'm not going to put myself on the spot.
Bad math.
And let's, like, for example, I kind of screwed that up last week. I still think if you knew J.K. Dobbins was going to be 30% owned, you'd have been a terrible play. But like, I didn't like him very much as chalk just because I expected that backfield to be split. But I probably did kind of get too far away from like, yeah, but they're going to run the ball 800 times against the Panthers, so it doesn't matter. That you do kind of get that with the Patriots too, where 30% of the Patriots carries is better than 30% of a lot of teams' carries.
Yep, exactly. Optimal Prime, thank you for the reminder. Yeah, please do hit the like button if you have not already done so, regardless of which YouTube channel you're on. If you're on the Endgame Syndicate YouTube channel or in the Flannelverse, we would appreciate it. Helps us out if you hit that like button. And of course, subscribing to both of our channels. The bigger help And you can find whichever YouTube stream you're on, you should be able to find it either in the description of the video, the link to the other YouTube channel, or you can just search Endgame Syndicate or Flannelverse. You'll be able to find us there and appreciate those subscriptions. And of course, if you want to get notifications when we go live, neither of us is doing a ton of content on our channels currently. I guess you're doing all of your MLB shows, so maybe it's just me who's not doing a ton of content. But anytime you get a notification, it's going to be for one of my Showdown shows. I do 2 each of Monday and Thursday, and then 1 on Sunday evening as well. So those are the only notifications you're getting currently. Of course, might add some stuff at some point, but yeah, if you want to get notifications when we go live, you can hit that notification button. Adam, any other? I don't think I'm going to JaMychal Hasty. I think he's too far. He might be the one who would get run in a blowout. I guess so. You can say that about JaMychal Hasty. Just 400 probably is more likely to have that role in a blowout because he doesn't normally have a role. Is that enough of a reason for you to play some JaMychal Hasty?
Probably not, but I mean, if you did, I guess, like, what's that lineup like if you're playing Hasty? You're probably just playing Hasty with no other Patriots. Probably not the Patriots defense because you're assuming that they gave up a bunch of points. So Breece Hall, Jets defense, Aaron Rodgers, Garrett Will, like the best Jets players, and then like JaMychal Hasty is your only Patriot. Is how you approach that?
Play for the Jets blowout. Hasty comes in. Yep, I think that is fine. Yeah, I think that
it also you're not even drawing entirely to the blowout. You then kind of do also just have that, like, the Patriots do absolutely nothing, and maybe it's not a blowout. Maybe it's like 17-0 or something. But like the Patriots do absolutely nothing. All offensive production is from the Jets / their defense gets fantasy points, and then Hasty's just the cheap guy that lets you afford the good players on the Jets.
Yeah, exactly. So you have that additional out. Yeah, that's always the nice thing about the cheap guys. You need him to outscore the min price guy, so he needs to score 8 fantasy points in that scenario to be the guy you need, but certainly capable of being that guy.
One way or the other, I think, barring like massive injuries to the Patriots, the clearest path I see to Hasty being in a lineup is a Jets onslaught.
Yep, that makes sense. All right, let's move on. Talk about some wide receivers, and again, you can see here the big drop off in fantasy points from Garrett Wilson to everybody else. I think Garrett Wilson probably the least interesting to talk about of the wide receivers in the game because he's just he projects really well. He's going to look like one of the better options in the game. I'm going to pull up his participation so far, but he leads the Jets in. Oh, this is broken down by game. I'll give the full overview before there are other players where we're going to want to look at the split week 1 to week 2. But Garrett Wilson he leads the Jets in route participation, 89.1%, 17 targets so far in the year, has a great role. What is your level of interest in Garrett Wilson, Adam?
Very interested, obviously. Do expect some shadow coverage here, but this is another thing, kind of like we were talking about earlier with man and zone and all of that I think there's a tendency a lot of times to think is more important for DFS than it is, especially when you're talking about like a showdown slate. We saw it last week where DK Metcalf didn't produce at all, or didn't produce very much at all when he was being covered by the guy shadowing him, but then he just torched everybody else, and it wasn't a 100% shadow rate, so still had the huge game. Could very easily see the same kind of thing from Wilson. Obviously, it doesn't matter which corner he's putting the numbers up against. So individually, probably a tougher matchup for him. You do expect them to look, and somebody mentioned it in chat a minute ago, you expect the Patriots to be doing what they can to take away Garrett Wilson, but still a very talented receiver, still a 1-game slate where you don't have a lot of offensive talent. Still think he looks good, even with those potential issues in mind. Have him projected closer to, so when you look at the top projected guys for me, Breece Hall is first by a lot. And then like Wilson, Stevenson, Rodgers are all very similar. So he's closer to Stevenson and Rodgers for me than them all. But still my second highest projected guy, showing up as optimal like 62% of the time. I think he's going slightly over-owned, but pretty much where he should be.
Yep, and I don't really think I have anything to add there. He's the top receiving option on the slate by a landslide. A good person to have in a lot of your lineups. I don't think I'm taking any kind of major stand on Wilson. Limited stars in this game. The field is going to be playing a ton of those stars. Wilson is one of those guys. So he's going to get a lot of ownership, but he also projects really well. Not the most interesting conversation to be had there. I think the interesting conversations begin with every other receiver is a more interesting conversation than Garrett Wilson. Starting with the Jets guys. So Allen Lazard, Mike Williams, and Xavier Gipson, I guess Malachi Corley are the potential options for the Jets. And this is where I did break it down. I thought it was an interesting conversation to break down, looking the week by week stats rather than just the composite. And you look at Allen Lazard went from 90.3% route share in week 1 to 66.7% route share in week 2, 9 targets down to 4. Looks like the role, week 1, which shout out to the show for nailing the Allen Lazard game. Looked great that game. He was playing every snap, running all the routes, looked and put up 2 touchdowns, had a great game, sort of fluky. This given that he kind of lost a little bit of that role last week, I think that probably the ownership is still going to be there on Lazard, at least to some extent. Let's see where he's at. Okay, 23.35% owned at 5.8K. Doesn't seem that outlandish to me. How do you feel about Lazard today, Adam?
So I think he's still, clearly expected to play a role in this offense. I am concerned about him just continuing to lose snaps here, because it's not like you were coming into the season saying, oh, it's a competition for wide receiver 2 between Mike Williams and Allen Lazard, and Allen Lazard won. There's no competition there. As soon as Mike Williams is able to run the bulk of the routes, Mike Williams is running the bulk of the routes. Yeah. And so I think you're just going to continue to see, Mike Williams come up and Allen Lazard come down. So that is obviously a concern. The counterpoint to that is that the Jets don't have a third receiver. Or anybody established as a third receiver. So Lazard's still probably going to have a role, at least early on in the season. At 5,800 though, that's a pretty healthy price tag, I think. And he's projected for more ownership than Mike Williams. I think my projection might be a little bit higher on Lazard than it should be, and lower on Williams than it should be. I have them projected pretty similarly, and still think that Lazard's going a little bit over owned and Williams is going under owned. I don't think Lazard's gonna just not run routes. He still ran routes 67% of the time last week, but that was compared to 90% week 1. I wouldn't be surprised if this week it's like 55% or something, and Williams just passes him.
Yeah, it's definitely I definitely like Williams better. Like in a vacuum, if they're the same price, the same ownership, I would rather play Williams than Lazard, because I think they're going on different trajectories, where Lazard is losing some of that work, Williams getting healthier, gaining some of that work. It was pointed out in chat, and that it is a good reminder that this is a short week, so not as clear that Williams will just keep ascending. Like I would feel more confident in a full week off than the short week from Sunday to Thursday, but still I think it is pretty likely. Like I haven't heard anything about any setbacks from the last game, anything like that. So I do still think Williams is the one that if he's going to come in at low ownership, and I imagine everybody around the industry sees this and thinks, oh yeah, Williams is gaining, Lazard is going down. It's not that complicated. So I would imagine it wouldn't be that shocking if we flip the cards over and Williams is higher owned than Lazard, but currently that's not what is projected to happen. Yeah, I like Mike Williams better at 6,200, and we've referred to it. I'll pull up the stats here so you guys can see. Mike Williams went from just 4 routes in week 1, 12.9% participation, to 18, 54.5% route participation in week 2. Still only has 1 target on the year, so don't love that for Mike Williams, but we kind of know that he's a talented receiver. I still think that is the case. So I would rather make that bet on Wilson, just taking on a bigger role as the season goes on. Sounds like you're on the same page as me, that you'd rather have more Wilson than Lazard.
Yeah, and as far as concerns about Williams too, negative separation score last week in his first game, first real game back from injury. So there is a real chance that he's just not 100% yet, or at least not 100% from shaking off rust standpoint, even if he's 100% healthy. But especially with it being a showdown slate, and it just going back to I can't just pick guys from another game, so I need to find something here. There's just so much more upside to being on Mike Williams for the first Mike Williams game than there is. We already had the Allen Lazard game where there was a ton of upside to just guessing and being right there. This is, there's a lot of upside to just be right on Mike Williams. I think it's much more likely that by the time we're at week 5 and looking back on what's happened in the season, that you can point to week 3 and it's oh, this is where Mike Williams showed that he is fully back at 100%. Then you look back and say oh, wow, remember when Allen Lazard did this in 3 years?
Right. Yep. So we're on the same page. Mike Williams, the preferred option there on the Jets. As far as other Jets receiving options, I mean, Gibson is the one who really lost his role from week 1 to week 2, went from 67.7% route participation in week 1, just 4 routes in week 2, 12%. I don't think I'm going to be playing any Gibson just given how much of that role he lost. Maybe if you think he's going to take on more of a role, if it is on a short week, maybe they do play Mike Williams a little bit less. You could play into that, but what are you doing with the $2,000 Xavier Gibson?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see it, especially at 2K. It's not like he's 600 and you're just hoping they like design like jet sweep from the 6 he scores. You know, like he's 2K. It's really tough. I have a hard time seeing the path for him because at no point, this goes back to the game 1 call. Like at no point did I think, or do I think he was going to be ahead of Lazard. Now you have Williams getting more routes. I don't really know where Gibson's participation is coming from.
Yep. Same page there. And same thing with Corley, or is he more playable because we think he might just have, that rare gimmicky play and score a touchdown? I think that's maybe slightly more likely with Corley than Gibson. I don't even know if I'm confident in that. Are you fading him as well?
So I actually didn't even have him. I think I messed up my spreadsheet, but I didn't even have him in there. But yeah, I think he's very similar. I'm not playing either of them probably.
Yeah. We also have some like not super low owned, but like relatively low owned option on the Patriots that make me less inclined to play the Gibson or Corley's. Now again, I guess the counterpoint would be, we talked about it with the running backs. There is still the possibility of a blowout, or maybe they get more run in that blowout, but it's a kind of thin bet in my opinion. Those tertiary receiving options on the Jets. The Patriots though, it's very interesting. So we have Jalen Polk has the highest projection on the slate. Pop Douglas, KJ Osborne, Tyquan Thornton, all there, and some interesting trends with the participation of the Patriots receivers from week 1 to week 2. Some little changes there. Speaking of, who is your favorite? Let's rank these Patriots receivers. Do you have a thought on who is your favorite of the group?
Do I get to say Hunter Henry?
No, it has to be receivers. I mean, yeah, Hunter Henry, too obvious. You got to do receiver.
I mean, it's either
exactly.
It's either Douglas or Polk, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that it's Douglas or Polk. I think Pop Douglas for me, and it's slightly narrative based. Did you see the stuff where Pop Douglas was complaining about his role? Like reporters were asking about him. He was like, have you had a chance to shine? He was like, last year, not this year. Like just like he was complaining. And then Jacoby Brissett responded to it and was like, I'm glad that he's frustrated. It would be concerning to me if he's not frustrated. We're going to get him involved at some point, but it's a long season, whatever. But like, so the fact that this conversation sort of happened after the last game where he complained, his quarterback acknowledged the complaint and like wasn't like, screw him, like we don't need to get him the ball, like, hey, yeah, we're going to get him the ball at some point. Need to remind him that it's a long season, whatever. It does make me think they might force feed him just a little bit to try to, the squeaky wheel narrative. So I think the squeaky wheel narrative is enough for me to bump things towards Pop Douglas, but I don't know, is that too narrative driven?
I mean, I do prefer the squeaky wheel narrative when it's on like a legit NFL
Showdown slate
and not just
some
dude on the Patriots.
Yeah.
True. Yeah, I mean, sure, he's cheap. Like it's not like he's taking targets from anybody good if they throw to him.
Exactly. They have no reason not to feed him the ball, so keep him happy.
Yeah, I mean I guess narrative isn't the right word. The argument that I would make for Polk over him is he's the guy actually getting open. He's 18th amongst all wide receivers this year that have run at least 20 routes in separation score on fantasy points.
Yep.
So like he's getting open. We saw increased targets for him last week. Still not a lot of targets, but more than one. So, like I can point to the data and say like maybe Polk starts getting more targets because he's the only guy getting away.
Actually good. Yeah.
Whereas Pop Douglas, yeah, maybe they scheme some more stuff for him to make him happy, but like also just, I don't know, get open and he might throw the ball.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that call out of Jalen Polk doing really well in the AS metric on fans, but I'm not going to pull it up here, but we'll just tell you he looks good. And we talk about like, oh, they're not taking away from a good receiver. He might be an actual good receiver, kind of a nice prospect. So could move up a little bit in the pecking order.
One other thing, as an aside, that I guess like is not exactly the right word, but there were times in the preseason that reports were that Polk was basically just Pop Douglas's backup as the slot receiver, and that concerned me because I think one thing that the industry kind of does wrong is like they just view wide receivers as wide receivers a lot of the time, and they're like, oh well, this guy is probably good and he's on a team that has weak receivers. But like if they were using him as the slot and Pop Douglas is the slot, that's a problem. He has been running routes out wide more so than in the slot. So those reports from training camp were either just wrong or it changed. 30 routes out wide this year for Polk, only 8 in the slot, 39 in the slot for Pop Douglas, only 7 out wide. So I do like that he is playing a distinctly different position than the only other receiver on the Patriots that I think is possibly any good.
Yep. No, that is a good narrative note there. And then Tyquan Thornton, I guess the only other receiver to think about here. He played 72%, ran routes on 72% of dropbacks in week 1, 56% in week 2 for Tyquan Thornton. I don't know if I think this is a small enough number, like raw number, that I'm not totally buying into it as a trend, but we have seen that's the other thing with Pop Douglas is he's getting targets. So that is he has getting targets being 8 on the year. So not a high number of targets, but yeah, but relative to other Patriots receivers, he is getting. Actually, this says 3 targets. Okay, so I am wrong. It was not Pop Douglas who was getting targets. Oh, it was KJ Osborne. He was the one that I was going to point out as he took on a bigger role because he got 6 targets in week 1. So then he played a little bit of a bigger role, ran more routes in week 2, only saw 2 targets in that game. So I think there might be something to KJ Osborne eating into Tyquan Thornton. I don't know. Do you have any read on that situation?
I would lean toward Osborne, but he is also twice as expensive at 3,200. I think they're both sort of the kind of cheap wide receiver that you can throw in there and hope that they happen to connect on, a deep ball or something. Thornton got the opportunities week 1. He never showed anything going back to his rookie year to make you think he was going to be a good receiver. KJ Osborne, kind of know what he is going back to his time in Minnesota. I think when you think about the outside receivers, that Polk is just going to be the guy that is pretty consistently out there. Ran routes on 63% of dropbacks last week. That was ahead of Thornton. That was ahead of Osborne, both of them slightly. But I think you see Osborne and Thornton kind of just like cutting into each other. Obviously, to some extent, Polk also. But Polk's the one that I'm confident kind of just runs routes like 60 to 70% of the time probably. And then the other 2 are probably going to fluctuate. And then Douglas, obviously, I think is, running whenever they have a receiver in the slot.
Yep. Good clarification from Crutches that he's saying that he thinks that Osborne's ownership is going to get squeezed as a result of people wanting to play Polk and Pop Douglas. And I think he's probably right. I don't think KJ Osborne is somebody that people are super excited to play. And I do like to see at least that he, did take on a little bit, ran some more routes last week. I don't feel extremely confident in that being a thing going forward, but what do we have the projected ownership at on KJ Osborne?
I have like 15% flex.
Yeah, which that does interest me in KJ Osborne. 8 targets so far on the year, 6 in week 1, gaining a role. That's sort of interesting me. I don't think he's a particularly great wide receiver, but he had, I think, a couple blow up games while he was on the Vikings. At least one really nice game on the Vikings. It's at least plausible that he gets a little bit more involved. So I don't hate the idea of playing some low owned KJ Osborne. All right, so we both have it. The top 2 being Polk and Pop Douglas. I think I lean Pop Douglas for narrative reasons. I guess also I actually didn't know that slot against the Jets was a thing, so maybe I'll have to look into that a little bit closer. But regardless, I'm buying into Pop Douglas a bit. He has great route participation, seems to still be like just based on the route participation. I think he's probably the wide receiver 1 there to me, followed by Polk. I think it would be then Osborne for me, the pretty clear number 3 and a number 3 that I actually kind of like, followed by Tyquan Thornton. Is it same order for you or any different there?
Polk probably 1 for me, but again, I don't know. It's really close between those 2. I guess I would go back to probably Pop Douglas 1, Polk 2. But yeah, the thing I think the overarching thing to keep in mind here is that there is a ton of uncertainty, obviously, in how the ball's going to be distributed to these guys, if they're going to produce at all. But everybody's aware of that. So there is still a benefit to playing these guys and just kind of hoping to be right. Like, I don't think the answer is, the answer very well could be, but I don't think the answer has to just be, I don't know how they're going to spread the ball out. They're probably not going to produce anyway. Let me just not play them. You have an entire wide receiver room that isn't going to get tons of ownership because nobody wants to play these guys. So you can embrace volatility, pay attention to ownership in spots like this. That does generally play a really big role when not only is there output volatility in how these guys produce, but there's input volatility in exactly who's running the routes, who's getting the targets. So if any of these guys were to kind of get steamed and start getting a ton of ownership, I would want to kind of just look at other ones. I do think that is kind of an interesting point with like Pop Douglas right now. I have projected for 22% ownership. Polk I have projected for like 15. I think Douglas projects a little bit ahead of Polk, but I have no confidence that he's like if you offered me 1.5 or 2 to 1 on Polk over Douglas, I'm taking that bet every single time.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I do expect that there is going to be a lot of running on the Patriots. But I think the field is going to play it that way. So I think that's why it's like becomes interesting to me to just buy into like, what if they do just pass a little bit more in this game, or just like even on low volume, their passes, they're outliers. Like the ball gets tipped, Patriots receiver catches it, runs in for a touchdown. You see weird stuff happen in football all the time. So just leaning into that volatility of like, it's a 1-game slate, probably not a lot of people playing through the passing game. So I kind of like the idea of just doing it, not because I think it's the likeliest outcome that they put up a lot of points, but that I think it's probably going to be more likely than the amount that the field is going to play it. Again, once per show reminder that I'm coming at it from a large field GPP perspective. So this isn't like something I want to do in a 100-man tournament necessarily, or definitely not in like head-to-heads, but in a large field GPP setting, just betting on the weird stuff happening and broken plays leading to passing touchdowns. That kind of stuff is the kind of thing I like to lean into a little bit.
Every single 1-game slate, everybody convinces themselves to know exactly how the game's going to go. And then every single 1-game slate, they bitch on Twitter because the game didn't go exactly how they thought it was going to go. And then like you get paid off better if it just doesn't go the way that everybody thinks it's going to go.
Yep, exactly. Tight ends. So you already alluded to, if you could have included him as your number one receiver, Hunter Henry would be that guy on the Patriots. He is 7,800. So the price, this is where it's like, man, that price tag relative to the studs, he's not that much cheaper than some of the players who project better than him. He is significantly cheaper than some of the players that project not that much worse. So just looking at the price tag, sort of feels like he should be a pay up to be contrarian spot. But what is the ownership there on Hunter Henry? We've got him at, actually that is pretty low. Projected ownership just 17%. That's pretty intriguing. Sounds like you like him.
I like him. I don't like the salary. Like I have him showing up optimal around 18%. So I don't think that feels too far off. The problem is that he's so much more expensive than the defenses, the Jets in particular, Greg Zuerlein. Like I have the Jets defense and Zuerlein both projected slightly ahead of Henry. Braylon Allen's not far behind him at $2,600 less from a median projection standpoint either. So that's why it's difficult to get to him. But if you are building a lineup that assumes the Patriots do anything through the air, I think he just becomes a bigger priority, because that is an example of where a median projection is not telling the whole story, because it's factoring in, what's most likely to happen. And that's the Patriots run the ball a lot. They don't move the ball well, etc. In games where, like if you just knew after the game ended, you don't have any details about how it happened, but the Patriots either A, just scored a lot of points, or B, threw the ball at a high rate, Hunter Henry's projection would skyrocket and he would be underpriced to 7,800. So like from a median standpoint, he's overpriced, but from a what if the Patriots actually play this game differently than we expect standpoint, he could very easily end up being underpriced once you like know what their game plan is.
Yeah, 11 targets last week. That is massive. 11 targets. So and maybe he just has that role as like the top receiving option for Jacoby Brissett. Maybe he is the favorite receiving option. So yeah, the role is pretty strong. The price tag seems kind of ridiculous, but at the end of the day, if that's going to drive ownership down, why not lean into that a little bit for a guy who might just be the number one pass catcher? 90.6% route participation last week. I like it. I think Hunter Henry low enough owned that I will be above weight to the field on Hunter Henry. We got the question earlier: would you play Hunter Henry and Austin Hooper in the same lineup? And you can see here, Austin Hooper, I guess, dropped the route participation a little bit last week, but still, 48% week one, still 28% in week two, kind of a low number. So I'm not overly concerned about it just yet. And does have 5 targets on the year, which I believe is third on the Patriots, maybe behind KJ Osborne. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but still has a significant target share on the team. I guess I could pull it up here. Are you interested in playing some low-owned Austin Hooper?
I mean, a little bit, I guess. Like he's showing up optimal 9% of the time for me at 2,400. I don't think he's like worse than most of the other guys priced around him. I am concerned by the drop in routes last week. just because Hunter Henry, we know has, and we expect to continue like dominating routes. So for Hooper to be getting routes, you need them to actually be playing with 2 tight ends on the field. And the more that they, play with more wide receivers on the field, that would cut into Hooper before it cuts into Henry, I think.
Yep. And the ownership on Hooper, again, coming in pretty low, sub 10%, 9%. So I do think he's a pretty solid option. Would obviously prefer if it was a little bit lower, but I think even at 9%, that is a reasonable enough ownership number on Hooper. Could just score a touchdown. So I don't dislike him as a play. I think he's very much, he's going to be in some of my lineups, maybe even above weight to the field on Austin Hooper. Tyler Conklin is a guy that we talked about on that last slate. And, I want to say like everything went well in that slate, the Niners versus Jets slate. That part did, because I was very into Tyler Conklin. I still think that he's probably due for some progression after last year's 61 catches, 0 touchdowns. I think that good things are going to happen at some point for Tyler Conklin. I'm hopeful. 73% route participation on the year. Just 3 targets, but that's on a team that is extremely concentrated. It's been Garrett Wilson, Allen Lazard, 30 targets on the year combined, and then it's 3 for Rucker, 3 for Conklin, 1 for Mike Williams. Like it's been so concentrated. I still think at some point Tyler Conklin is going to get involved. He has a price tag of just 2,800, projects well there. What's your level of interest there in Tyler Conklin?
So one other thing I wanted to say about Hooper, I didn't have it pulled up in time, but even though his route participation went down last week, the Patriots. Brissett's dropbacks tied for 3rd week 1 in 12 personnel and 2nd last week, 10 and 11 respectively. So they were at least still putting 2 tight ends on the field, which I think is something that does make the chances of Hooper being more involved this week a little bit higher than if we had just seen like a complete change where he wasn't on the field as much. So that's good. As far as Conklin, I think he's fine. Like 70% routes last week, 77% week 1. He hasn't been getting targets, but he's cheap enough and the opportunity should be there. One thing that does stand out is, Rucker out-targeted him last week 10% to 3%. Rucker's route participation dropped from 23% week 1 to 6% week 2. So overall, like, I think that's probably a better sign for Conklin than Rucker.
I think so too. Yeah.
He ended up being more involved.
Yeah, that is kind of a weird thing, but it seems just sort of fluky that Rucker was targeted more on very few routes. He saw 3 targets on 2 routes run. That feels wrong.
That seems unlikely.
Yeah, it seems like maybe something I need to point out to them, maybe a bug, but either way, I'm not overly concerned about Rucker. I think
or some random fluke play, like I
yeah,
don't know how they classified like Pat Mahomes throwing the ball to himself.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, depending on where he lines up, I'm like, would he be ineligible if he's not, running a route? But maybe there's plays where he doesn't run routes, but he's still eligible as a receiver. So maybe that's what happened there. Probably just a fluke play.
Either way, didn't run a lot of routes and happened to just like get targets on all of them.
Yep. All right. Defenses and kickers, I think, are going to be chalky on this slate, as you would expect on any kind of slate where everybody's expecting it to be pretty low scoring. And I'll just bring up the ownership here. We have the Jets defense, 23% projected ownership. The Patriots defense, 19% projected ownership. Actually, not quite as high as I was kind of expecting it to be. Greg Zuerlein at 21% projected ownership, and Joey Sly at 18%. So honestly, I kind of thought those numbers were going to be a little bit higher. Is this just we did all this talking, looked at all the numbers for all the receivers, the running backs, the tight ends, the quarterbacks. Is it just going to be a kickers and defenses slate?
Probably, yeah. And I think ownership projections might just be low, at least on like the Jets.
I
have the Jets defense being the most under-owned flex play on the slate right now on DraftKings. I have Breece Hall at captain being the most under-owned play, period. But the Jets right now, I only have projected like 24%. I have them being optimal 30, 31. Usually when I get a gap like that on anything I do early in the day, it just means that the ownership projection is low because so many people have some sort of similar process to me. But that is interesting. Like they are one of the most frequently optimal flex plays for me. The price tag is fine. The matchup, is good. The only, I guess, negative is if you wanted to find one, other than, maybe the Patriots just score points somehow. But like the upside for a defense is higher if a team is likely to throw more, just because dropbacks lead to sacks and interceptions and pick sixes, and stuffing the run just leads to not scoring a lot of points and not scoring, limiting their points scored, which is good, but it's not what like scores you 25 fantasy points or anything. So like that would be, I guess, a negative for the Jets. But on a 1-game slate at a very reasonable price tag, and at least an ownership projection right now that is in line with a lot of guys that I don't really like. I think the Jets look really good. I think Zerline looks good at 5K. The Patriots side of it, obviously less so, just because you expect the Jets to move the ball more than the Patriots. You expect the Patriots to score less than Zerline and the Jets, but kickers and defenses look good to me, particularly the Jets.
Yep, I think that is a good call. I will say I was looking for any like additional reasons to play the defenses. Jacoby Brissett sacked just 4 times so far this year.
Yeah.
Aaron Rodgers 3, so they're not taking a lot of sacks. This is a very small sample size, so I also don't want to make it sound like this is extremely meaningful through 2 weeks. But I think like generally, Aaron Rodgers is not somebody who takes a ton of sacks. Just 1 interception on the year for Aaron Rodgers, 0 for Jacoby Brissett. But again, I don't really care that much. This is really small sample size. I think and we only have so many options to play on the slate. So if they can just limit the number of points, get a couple, sacks, turnover here or there might be enough. You don't need a huge score, and obviously score a touchdown in a low scoring game. That would be just wheels up for the defenses. So yeah, I think defense and kickers going to look very strong on this slate. All right. And anything else we need to talk about? I think we may have got through. We've talked about every position. Did you have any other, overarching thoughts on the slate?
No, other than, and I kind of talked about it with the wide receivers, I do think it's one of those slates where you should just kind of be uncomfortable with your lineups. Like, just be comfortable with being uncomfortable and understanding that, like, there's a very clear, most likely way this game goes, but it doesn't necessarily pay you that well to play it that way. So I think kind of just embracing the volatility of what it looks like if the Patriots in particular actually score fantasy points offensively, what that looks like, and just kind of taking some shots on that makes some sense. Obviously the Jets, there's less uncertainty there. Like, if they do well, you kind of assume that it's going through Hall, Wilson, and then one of Williams, Lazard.
Yep. Chris Williams, the Apple guy. Good to see you make it over to my channel, Chris. You should also check out the Endgame Syndicate channel. More Adam content there as well. But thank you for stopping in, Chris Williams. Good to see you. Would you do a minimum 1 defense kicker in a 150 set? I wouldn't. I would have a good amount of kickers and defenses, but definitely not in a 150 set. I wouldn't do minimum 1.
I wouldn't. I mean, a lot of, like, I wouldn't want that in general, but also, like, my lineup building process is going to just handle it. Like, if they're that good of a play, then I'll end up having it anyway. Yeah. But yeah, like, I really, really try not to set arbitrary rules like that where I'm just deciding this before I run my lineups. Like, I really want a process in place where I build lineups, and my process is creating lineups that, like, are handling the volatility and projection and everything correctly, so I don't have to set rules like that.
Okay. Yeah, no, also as Steven says, it will come up naturally quite a bit. You're going to get a lot of defenses and kickers. Keith Fape says, wait a second. I don't know. We'll keep going. I think we're closing in on the end of the show. If you had one more question, we would take it. But yeah, I don't know what to make of that. Oh, he was on Adam's channel. Not realize. I mean, are you subscribed there? You should subscribe there. Subscribe to both of our channels if you haven't already done so. We would appreciate it. Adam, are you doing anything else today? You doing any MLB content? What else do you have coming up?
Yeah, I'll have my MLB tournament show at like 4:45 or 5. Slate starts at like 6:40 today, so I'll probably start a little early. Just taking a look at DraftKings tournaments. Also, in general, my content that is available through both Endgame and my Dub Club now is on the Endgame site itself, not just in Discord. So a little bit less of a pain in the ass if you are subscribed there to see my stuff. I can just post it on the site. You can see it there behind the paywall. So makes it a little bit easier for everybody. Yep.
Go check out Adam's stuff. You can find the Dub Club. It was not in the description of the last video. I copy and pasted the wrong video or something, but it's in there now. Yeah, it's in Adam's. It's in there now on mine, so you can find the Adam's Dub Club in the description of this video. You can find both of our YouTube channels. At least if you're in the Flannelverse, you can find both of our YouTube channels there. Otherwise, you can search for us, Flannelverse, Endgame Syndicate. Do appreciate anybody subscribing to our channels as we are trying to grow them. Liking the videos, commenting, all of that is a great help. So really appreciate all of you supporting us as we try to grow our channels. Thank you. And I will be back tonight, 90 minutes prior to the game starting. I'll be back with updated, if there is any updated information. Maybe I'll look a little bit closer into Jets versus slot to see what Crushes is talking about. But yeah, I'll be back 90 minutes prior to lock. Would appreciate you coming to hang out for that as well. Thanks, guys, and we'll catch you next time. Oh, it didn't work. I clicked end stream.